Thank you very much, Mr. President. Quelle transition de la jeunesse au journalisme. Mais je voudrais quand même aussi remercier l'Académie du Royaume du Maroc pour m'avoir invité et de parler des enjeux que nous avons comme journalistes travaillant en Afrique. Et je voudrais aussi souligner, parce que nous avons beaucoup de doctorants dans la salle, dont je parle, le sujet dont je parle est dû de ma thèse de doctorat que j'ai travaillé au Canada, et qui est un sujet que je continue d'ailleurs à travailler comme post-doctorat à l'université de Cambridge, Royaume, United Kingdom. How do you say that in French? Royaume-Uni, voilà. Mais puisque nous n'avons pas le temps, je vais parler en anglais. Si je peux maintenant faire la transition du français en anglais, si vous permettez. Merci. Alors, l'Ubuntu. Oh, ça doit marcher. Ça marche, voilà. OK. Le peuple bantou. The Bantu peoples represent, obviously, those of you who don't know, a generic label for several ethnic groups numbering between 300 and 600. I'm not a social anthropologist, but that's what social anthropologists say, who speak related languages with the same root, Ntu or Mtu in Swahili, for instance, but all of them meaning the same thing, person. The person or human being. Right from Central Africa, as you can see, all the way South Africa, where Mr. President comes from. And these peoples inhabit a geographical area, as you can see on the map, stretching all the way. The immigrations, of course, are pointed there. But the interest really for my thesis is the philosophy, the Ubuntu philosophy, and how we as journalists can be inspired from this philosophy to develop media values or journalism values, journalism norms, to help us deal with the many challenges and many problems we have on the continent. The Ubuntu philosophy is summarized by many scholars, but I will quote one very able scholar, Eze. The name sounds West African, but he has done a lot of work in this respect. And the Ubuntu philosophy is summarized as a person is a person through other people. Okay? A person is a person through other people. It seems obvious, but when you see the many wars and the many problems we have on this continent, this doesn't seem that obvious. Which strikes an affirmation of one's humanity through recognition of the other. And again, here there is a lot of work by several Arab scholars that talk about otherness. The other in his or her uniqueness and difference. It is a demand for a creative intersubjective formation in which the other becomes a mirror for my subjectivity. This idealism suggests us that humanity is not embedded in my person solely as an individual. My humanity is co-substantively bestowed upon the other and me. I'm sorry for the interpreters. I speak very fast, but we don't have a lot of time, Mr. President. Humanity is a quality we owe to each other. We create each other and need to sustain this otherness creation. And if we belong to each other, we participate in our creations. We are because you are, and since you are, definitely I am. So that's the Ubuntu philosophy. The I am is not a rigid subject, but a dynamic self-constitution dependent on this otherness creation of relation and distance. The term Ubuntu has also evolved to connote a humanistic philosophy. And here we know that the South Africans have been working a lot on this topic. They have actually been the ones who have popularized the Ubuntu philosophy all the way from Nelson Mandela, but to people like Bishop Desmond Tutu and many others. This humanistic philosophy of collective personhood and is best comprehended in maxims such as, my humanity is inextricably tied to your humanity. It is the view that I am human because I belong, I participate, I share. From the perspective of the Ubuntu philosophy, it is collective personhood and the primacy of the individual in communion with others that is the essence of human existence. The Ubuntu philosophy represents virtues such as group cooperation, generosity, hospitality, caring, compassion, tolerance, respect, sharing, solidarity, forgiveness, conciliation, and many other such wonderful virtues. And so these are some of those. Ça va? La traduction? Ça va? Okay. So it's these values that in my thesis then I look at to see these Ubuntu values, which of course seem human values, which seem Arab values, which seem Moroccan values, and there is no doubt that yes, they are, because indeed it represents a communitarian ethic that we know from several scholars of philosophy. It is these values that then I look at to see how can they be reframed, how can they be deconstructed into journalism values, into journalism norms. You can't do that without, when you do a reframing, it means you have a departure. So which departure? And my departure for the reframing are the Western-centric journalism media values, which are the conventional journalism values that we learn in journalism schools, but that we also teach in journalism schools. And which are these conventional journalism values? These are objectivity. Those of you who have been to journalism school, you know this, objectivity, not subjectivity, detachment, that you must be detached from the subject, from the story, that you must be neutral, and not attached, not attachment or interestedness, which is contrary to the Ubuntu philosophy. Truth or factuality, not so much the emphasis on context and background, which is very much part of the Ubuntu philosophy, and individual freedom of expression. You hear all these. We talk about freedom of expression, not collective voices or consensus building. So it is noteworthy, therefore, that in all these forms that I've talked about, in these norms that I've talked about, the Western-centric journalism norms, the emphasis is on the individual, while the Ubuntu philosophy, the emphasis is on the community, is on the humanness of the other, the otherness. Clearly, the above stated conventional journalism norms ignore ingrained African or Bantu, if I may use that generic word, cultural values such as community participation, consensus building, widespread communal consultation that are often born from obviously the cultural, the cultures, but also the religious belief systems. I think one of the presenters in the morning talked about some of these issues. Such Western-centric journalism values, because of their emphasis on ensuring a distance or detachment from the other, have tended to encourage a mode of journalism practice that has perpetuated stereotypes that have restricted the perception of the African continent to one filled with poverty. I mean, you know all this, huh? You've been on the African continent, you know how Western media portray Africa and the continent. Poverty, disease-ridden, malnourished, political and ethnic strife, barbaric killers. These days you talk about terrorists and so on in Somalia and all this. And the philosophies, of course, the philosophers will continue to discuss all these issues, and they will tell you that maybe one is terrorist, is another is liberator. And you know, you can always have a conversation about this or this. But this is how, really, when you look at the Western media and the portrayal of Africa, this is what we see. The main reason, of course, for such perpetuation of Western-centric media values is not only because of the phenomenon called parachute journalism, whereby Western journalists come to the continent, they spend 2 days, 1 day, and they start writing about the continent as if they know what's going on, but also because we journalists, African journalists, those who are based on the African continent, how many minutes, Mr. President? 5, 2? We, in journalism schools in Africa, have not developed Afro-centric journalism values. And that is really the objective of my thesis. And as you know, when you are doing a doctoral work, most of les doctorats qui sont ici, on va vous demander toujours d'être originel. C'est quoi votre contribution? And you have to continue, you know, working. And so this is part of my contribution, to try to look at the Afrocentric media, you know, the Ubuntu philosophy, and try to extrapolate some of these values and see how they can be extrapolated and deconstructed into journalism values. Of course, the challenge is not only, I should not just blame the Western-based journalists, parachute journalism, but we journalists who are based on the African continent, because we use journalism norms, the journalism values that I talked about earlier on, then we end up covering issues using the same frames. And if we use the same frames, because this is what we are taught in journalism schools, then you end up doing exactly what we blame our Western colleagues of doing. And therefore, that's why it's important, and that's why I think within the theme of this conference, which is Africa as a horizon of thought, to reflect on these Afrocentric media values. And Afrocentricity here, when I talk about Afrocentric, I mean really not only that which is of African origin, for instance, blackness, black people, wherever they will see you in the world, they will know you of African origin. But I also mean, and especially so, an inward-looking outlook at the interests of Africa. So in this respect, whoever works for the interests of Africa and of the African peoples and of the African continent is Afrocentric. Therefore, an Afrocentric media regime that is inspired by the Ubuntu worldview would stimulate citizen or community participation and consensus building based on widespread consultation with the community. Unlike Western-centric journalism norms, such as the ones I talked about, truth, freedom, and justice, or freedom of expression for that matter, or factuality that favor individualism. The Ubuntu norms are grounded in the community as the nucleus of action and decision-making. In the Ubuntu philosophy, journalism values such as truth, freedom, and justice are to be constructed by and within the community. And in this respect, media and news reports ought to be interpreted against the background of the community's contexts, beliefs, values, and needs. In the Ubuntu worldview, the role of the media is towards promoting bonding, merci, and dialogue to build consensus. The emphasis thus moves from the media as informant, as gatekeepers, entertainers, educator, to media as mediator. From the media as observer, to the media as participant and negotiator. So it's a very involved media, it's a very involved journalism, not a journalism of detachment, which is the conventional model. From the above analysis emerges a journalism paradigm that does not place a high premium on Western-centric norms of objectivity, neutrality, truth, and detachment. It is a model in which a journalist is an involved member of the community and not a spectator of events to report on, like the conventional journalism model proposes. In the Western philosophy, Ubuntuism has an affinity to communitarian ethics, those of you who are familiar with this philosophy, or what North Americans call civic journalism, which emphasizes a close relationship between the media and the community on issues such as strengthening civic culture, rejuvenating public life, reaching consensus rather than conflict. Finally, Mr. President, because you gave me a 5 minutes warning, I don't know whether that's as visible because I copied from a Word document into a PowerPoint, so probably it's not as visible. But I can also tell you that this is a work in progress. Those of you who are interested really in my work, there is a book coming out by Codesria where I discuss this concept in more detail and less constrained by the time of a conference. But what you see on the board here are the journalism values that I have extrapolated from the Ubuntu philosophy, and a proposal that these values can become a monitoring and evaluation framework for journalists when they are covering events, but also for editors when we are doing editing work, so that you look at a story. When a journalist brings you a story, when you are editing a story, that you are able to see the humanness in that particular story. Does this story promote reconciliation and forgiveness other than conflict? Because when it bleeds in journalism, it leads, as we say. Does it promote cooperation, collaboration, and consensus? Do you give voice to the peacemakers and peace processes? Do you promote the concept of patience and moderation amongst the protagonists? The concept of truth and justice, and the concept, of course, of order and harmony. So these are, of course, issues that we can continue to debate. Because of time, obviously, we don't have the time to go into some of these details. But what I can say in conclusion, Mr. President and dear colleagues, is that if we take the case of the many African continents, for instance, the Ubuntu philosophy or worldview, unlike the liberal Western view, does not separate aggressor from the victims. A dispute between members of society is perceived as one involving the whole community. In that logic, an individual who has been wronged depends on the community to remedy the wrong, since in a way, the group has also been wronged. The key features in such a worldview are therefore forgiveness, their healing, their reconciliation and restorative justice, as opposed to constitutive justice. These were the values that, for instance, informed the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission that Mr. President is very aware of. Mr. President, it is true that Ubuntuism as an African normative theory no longer exists in its pure form. I'm aware of that, given the fact that over the years, traditional African cultures have interacted with other ideologies, such as Christianity and Islam. Further, colonialism also brought Africa into contact with new moral and cultural values, as well as new modes of production that have all compounded the erosion of African or Bantu traditional culture. Nonetheless, it is still possible, and I think a noble cause, especially within the theme of this conference, that in an Africa that is now multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multi-racial, institutions such as schools ought to encourage a negotiation between Western-centric values that favor individualism and libertarianism with Afro-centric values that favor communautarism. Je vous remercie beaucoup.
Thank you very much. That was